Hello, my name is Julia Gaskill, and I am a slam poet. I am 29 years old. I was born and raised here in Portland, Oregon. I moved away for a few years to go to college, and then I spent a year abroad in New Zealand, and then I ended right back where I started, here in Portland. I've always been a writer, mostly writing stories and scripts, and then a whole lot of fan fiction when I was younger. But when I got to college, I stumbled across spoken word poetry. A roommate of mine gave me a CD of the poet Shane Hawley, a lot of his poems, and I was just instantly hooked. This led me to discover people like Andrea Gibson, Anis Mushgani, Sarah Kay, Phil Kay. This was before button poetry, but there were still like videos on YouTube, and so I kind of just fell down that rabbit hole, and I was just so hooked from the get-go. Once I returned to Portland, I really wanted to check out the local spoken word slam poetry scene here, and I started attending the Portland Poetry Slam religiously every Sunday, and I haven't stopped going since, except in the case of a pandemic right now. In my 6 years of being part of the spoken word community here in Portland, I helped co-found Slamlandia, which I now run as Slam Master. Slamlandia is a twice-a-month poetry open mic and slam, and Literary Arts hosts us once a month. I also founded the Bigfoot Regional Slam, a 2-day poetry festival and tournament, which took place here in Portland for the first time ever last summer. And this summer would have been the second time ever it would have been hosted, except, again, pandemic. I've self-published 4 chapbooks. I have a spoken word album, and I've been published several times on various online journals, as well as a couple well-known YouTube channels like Slamfind and Right About Now. I've toured with my poetry and been paid for my performances all across this country. I have a collaboration forthcoming with the band Impulse Control, and I've competed with my slam poetry on a national scale, placing in the top 30 2 different times in 2 different events. Okay, enough about me. That's too much about me. Let's get to why we are here. Today, I'm here from the comforts of my bedroom to talk to y'all about the importance of revision and refining in slam poetry. I'm going to go over why revision is essential, some tips on how to approach revising a spoken word piece, and then leave y'all with a couple of examples on revision exercises that you can try out in your own time. Let's begin. The reason revision is important is because revision is basically editing, and everyone should edit. Look, sometimes you get lucky and you sit down, write a piece, and it's perfect. No editing necessary. I'm not saying that that's impossible. I've even been lucky to have that happen to me a couple times with my poems. But at the end of the day, not everything you write is going to be a slam dunk, and there's nothing wrong with going back to the drawing board or even just finding a few things to tweak on a piece you've written that you'd really like to see excel. Revising allows you to look at a poem and find the things that are necessary to the piece, and then either get rid of everything that's not important to the poem or just rework the parts that you do like but aren't quite there yet. Let's say that you wrote an amazing poem on a theme like the ocean or outer space, and you have a ton of metaphors that work into the theme throughout, but then in revising your poem you notice that some of the metaphors kind of wander or just are like too much of a reach. In your editing process, you can then just flat out do away with the parts of the poem that don't really connect with the rest, or if you like them, you can just rework them slightly so that they better fit the theme of the poem. That's just one example of why you might edit, but there are so many reasons to edit a piece. Maybe in revisiting your poem for editing, you realize your whole 6th stanza is a tangent that makes no sense and totally detracts from the poem. Then you just get rid of it, or maybe even save it for a different poem somewhere down the road. Or you could go through and cut out lines here or there that just don't fit your cadence, and the flow like just doesn't go with the rest of the piece that's written. Or even it could just be going through poems and getting really like nitpicky and taking out like the ands and the thes and the that's that just aren't necessary, and just getting really into the nitty-gritty of it. There are several benefits to revising. First off, you end up with a stronger poem. By trimming the unnecessary and reworking what you want to keep, your poem gains polish and finesse. But also, when you revisit poems and spend a lot of time with them, you end up getting to know your poem a whole lot better. So when it comes time to perform your poem in front of an audience, you'll find that you're just a lot more comfortable with speaking the poem into existence. You'll have created a sense of familiarity with the piece. And as a spoken word poet, that is something that's so important in getting its poem on its feet and then also eventually getting that poem memorized. So some of you might be wondering, how do I go about revising a slam poem in the first place? Well, I have been doing this for going on 6 years now, and I have a few tips and tricks up my sleeve that I'm going to share with y'all. This revising tip is by far the easiest and definitely the one that you want to start out with when you're editing a piece. Here are the steps. 1. Write your poem. 2. Go do something else and leave the poem alone. 3. Come back to it. Stepping away from the poem you're working on allows you to come back to it with fresh eyes. Often when we poets write, especially if we're writing about something we feel extra passionate about, which is almost everything if you're a poet, it's easy to get lost in the emotion of the piece. And it's tricky to take a step back and recognize what is and is not working when you're in that process. Letting yourself step away and come back allows you to clear your head and be less defensive over the first draft. Sometimes you write a piece of poetry that you really love, but ultimately don't know what to do with it, direction-wise. Stepping away and taking it off your plate can be a big help. When you revisit the poem down the line, you might have a better sense of direction you want to take the piece in after you've had some time apart with it. And it's totally up to you for how long you need to step away from your poem, and it might vary from poem to poem. It could be an hour, a day, a week, a month, even a whole year. It honestly depends on you and also the poem. Here are 2 examples about poems that I've written. The first one, I wrote a poem called Dog Walker's Lament a couple years ago, and it's a poem that's about street harassment. When I sat down, I wrote this poem in one sitting, and I was very angry at the time. I then went away for a couple days and came back to it, and at that point I was able to suss out what worked for the points I was trying to get across and what really didn't. And then the second one, back in 2016, I started writing a slam piece about Monica Lewinsky and the unfair treatment she received back in the late 90s. I wrote about 2 pages of this poem, and I really liked it, but I just didn't know what the heck to do with it. So I left it alone for 2 whole years. I just let it sit. I knew I wanted to come back to it, but I knew it wasn't important at the time because I didn't know what to do with it, and that's a big part of writing. And then the trial with Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford happened, and I remembered the piece, and then I came back to it and I had the direction for it, and I tied it in with modern times. So really, again, you could step away for an hour or a day and then come back to the piece, or it could be multiple years, however long you need and however long the poem needs. Ultimately, stepping away and coming back refreshed and ready will ultimately benefit you and your poem. Since the piece you're revising is a slam poem, obviously we need to bring speaking into the mix next. The end goal of a spoken word poem is you will either perform it in front of an audience on an open mic or at a feature or something, or you will compete with that poem in a poetry slam. So eventually people will hear what your poem sounds like, so it's important that you practice saying it in your own personal time. And often that personal time will be your rehearsal of the poem, which doubles as, you guessed it, your editing process. Speaking the poem out loud essentially lets you hear if the poem is working. Is it too clunky? Are there awkward line transitions? Are there portions your tongue trips over? Ideally, your piece works both on the page and on the stage, but often poems need to be finessed a certain way if they're going to be memorized and performed with a certain level of emotion. One of my biggest problems as a poet is that I tend to way overwrite. When I say my poems out loud to myself, it helps me find all the awkward, way too long verses, or even like the unnecessary stanzas that can easily be shortened or just cut without losing any of the actual meaning of the poem. This process also helps you capture your own voice. We all have our own natural cadences, the way in which we speak, and that doesn't always get reflected in our personal writing, especially like on the page. If you're reading out loud a poem that you've written and you find you can't say it the same way that you read it in your head, then rewrite it. Your poem should flow easily from you. Your tongue shouldn't have to do cartwheels to make sure every word is said correctly. So you've written your initial piece. Wonderful. You gave it some space and came back for edits. Great. You've said the poem to yourself like 36 times in your bedroom and annoyed your entire family. Perfect. But maybe you're just not quite ready to perform your poem for an audience. Maybe it's really raw, or it's vulnerable, or it's a funny poem, but you don't know if it'll grab the audience, or maybe you're just flat out nervous because, well, audiences are a bit nerve-wracking. This is when you want to start performing it for an audience of one. This could be a friend, a partner, a mentor, teacher, someone who has the time to discuss your poem with you. It's important you ask someone you either trust or admire, ideally both. You can do this so many ways. Maybe the person who's looking at your poem lives far away. You can send them the poem via the magic of technology, and then they can email you back with feedback and maybe even some edit suggestions. You can meet up for coffee with a friend, and the person can give you critique in person, going over the poem on the written format, or even meet up at one of your houses or in a rehearsal space and either read the poem aloud for them or full-on perform it. It really does come down to where you're at with the piece and what you're looking to get from the feedback from the person. It's important whoever you ask to share your poem with is someone you honestly want feedback from. If you know going into this that you just want someone to read or hear your piece and then you're just gonna brush off whatever critique you're given, maybe ask someone else. The purpose of this exercise is for someone to intake the art you've created and give you their honest feedback. And it's important that you listen and take in what you've been told. Now, that's not to say that all feedback you get should 100% be applied to your poem. Follow your gut. That's important. Follow your gut. Sometimes the advice you're given just really doesn't fit you as a writer, and that's okay. You don't have to follow every edit suggestion given to you. That might be especially difficult if you were to share your poem with maybe multiple friends and you have one person saying, wow, this line blew me out of the water, while someone else is saying, meh, I'd cut that line, it doesn't really add anything. Poetry is art, and art is subjective. It's still important to listen. Give the person sharing their feedback a chance to get their point across, and at least consider the advice they're giving you. Another quick reason that critique can be very important is because it could help point out any hurtful words or ideas that might be in your poem. It is important to be aware of using any ableist, racist, transphobic, homophobic, or misogynistic language, unless you are writing a reclaiming piece. Important note. But sometimes poets with even the best intentions slip up. It's good to have an extra pair of eyes that can point these things out to you before you bring it to a wider audience, and overall just learn from it and do better and move on. Another personal example is that I have a poem that is called I Will Not Beg for Scraps, which is probably my most well-known slam piece. I wrote it when I first started actively competing, and after I wrote it, edited it, and memorized it, I didn't touch it, and I just performed it as it was for 3 whole years. Then I made the Portland Poetry Slam team and was going to go compete in nationals in Denver, I believe in 2016, 2017. Time's not real right now. We're in a pandemic. In being on a national poetry slam team, a big part is just practicing poems over and over again for an entire summer. And one of my poems I was taking to Nats was I Will Not Beg for Scraps. And after doing a lot of practices, I ended up changing like a whole 2 stanzas, despite having had the poem for so long. With the help and critique from my team, I was able to make edits that ultimately made the poem a lot stronger. Which, I don't know, that just goes to show that it's never too late to revise a poem. Never. So you've written and edited your slam poem. You said it out loud way too many times. and then you showed it to a friend or a mentor. The final step of revision is obvious. Perform your piece for an audience. Typically with a slam poem, you've got two options. You could compete with your poem in a poetry slam, or you could read it in a poetry open mic. Personally, if I have a new poem I'm still in the process of revising and I'm still not quite sure about it, I'll choose to read it in an open mic setting. If I'm feeling a bit more confident, I'll bring it to a poetry slam, but often because poetry slams are a bit more intense and competition comes into it, doing your poem on an open mic is a bit more laid back. I'd also definitely recommend, if you do want to read on a poetry open mic, find one that's connected to a local poetry slam in your area. Poetry slams are geared towards having audiences that are very receptive. They snap, they clap, they'll cheer, they'll yell things like, "Go in, poet, don't be nice. The points don't matter," and they yell a lot of things at you. They let you know how they feel about the poem that you're doing. And when you're looking to get feedback from an audience, that experience is just so great and wonderful, and it really ends up helping you a lot. When you perform a poem for the first time for a live audience, you walk away with both audience feedback and inner feedback. An audience will tell you what is and isn't working. Maybe you had one funny line that you thought would make everyone crack up, but it didn't get a single laugh. But maybe you also had this one line that packs a punch, and when you delivered it to the audience, everyone gasped because it's such a good line. Ultimately, the audience at a poetry slam gives off an energy, and if your poem is or isn't well received, you can tell. Inner feedback is a little bit more tricky. It requires taking a moment with yourself to ask, how did I feel reading the poem? Did I feel good? Did I feel awkward? Did I feel maybe even stupid? Assess your overall emotional takeaway from the poem, and often that will inspire your piece to go in all new and different directions. And when you bring it back to your open mic or your slam, maybe it's a whole different beast that will just wow people in its new form. And yeah, that's it. That's all of my tips and tricks as a poet. I hope that they help you. But one last thing, I want to leave y'all with a couple exercises when it comes to editing and revising poetry. For this one, take a couple poems you've already written and feel good about. Now see how many articles and conjunctions you can remove from each of the poems and still have them make complete sense. It seems simple, but often we as poets lean heavily on words like the, and, but, if, and so on. When you take the time to remove these words from your poem, they might take a different shape, and you'll be surprised that you might like them even more. Set a timer and write for 5 minutes nonstop. If you're at a loss for how to phrase something better, just keep writing, even if what you're writing makes absolutely no sense. Once the 5 minutes are up, take a small break. Now come back to the poem. Set your timer for 10 minutes this time, and go through the poem and edit it until it makes sense. Maybe that looks like cutting all the weird tangents your brain took you on when you didn't know what to write about anymore, or maybe it's finding a way to connect the multiple strings of thought you experienced during the free write. Take a spoken word piece you've written, and for this one, it'd probably be better if you have it memorized already. Now perform it in 5 different ways. Different accents, different tones, different moods or emotions. Try it silly, sullen, southern accented, singing, screaming, anything. Doing this changes your relationship with the poem and can help you discover new things about the piece. It will help you find the emotional resonating points of the poem, which can lead you back to edit it and make it all fit into the tones that you've discovered in doing this exercise. I hope this was of help to you. I want to give a big thank you to Literary Arts for giving me this opportunity to share with y'all. Again, I hope it was helpful and that it provides y'all examples and just new tricks on revising spoken word pieces. And I also want to give a big thank you to my partner, Stephen Meads, who gave me a lot of feedback in the script writing process of this talk, because even sometimes putting on a video presentation requires you to get some critique and feedback. It all is just full circle, essentially. Thanks so much for watching this. I hope it was of help. Stay safe during this time. Take care.